It's not made for that. That's how we began this series, with a video that was funny about a couple of guys, and one had to be constantly reminded that the things that he was about to do with certain items, it wasn't made for that. And we've been talking about that in regards to marriage, that God designed marriage in a certain way, and in some cases it's not made for that. And while that's certainly true of marriage, and we're continuing that idea today, we're going to talk about it specifically in regards to the sexual relationship. And I think we would all understand that from God's design, there are certain things that we could say about sex, that it wasn't made for that. And today we're going to talk about what it is made for. Let me just caution you, parents, if you've got a young one in the room with you, I'm rating this kind of a PG-13. While we'll not talk about anything graphic, we will talk about the sexual relationship between a husband and wife, and I want to give you an opportunity just to remove anybody that you might not want to hear that, and thus have continuing conversations about what it is that we're talking about. So welcome back to week number 4, our final week in this series we've called Marriage by Design. We've been looking at what God has made marriage for. We've been talking about God's plan, God's purpose, God's design for marriage, and we've talked about it being an exclusive relationship between a man and a woman, that God designed it for a husband and wife to be together, and He specifically created a man and a woman to complement one another. We talked in week number 2 that marriage was designed in such a way that it would be a principal relationship, that our spouse ought to be the primary relationship that we have here on earth. And then in week number 3, we talked about it being a permanent relationship, that God designed marriage to be lifelong, that God designed that it would be a bond that would be for life. And so those have all kind of come together and built upon one another. And one of the verses that we've used often in this series is from Genesis 2:24, the very beginning, the very first marriage. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. It has been a foundational view. We talked about it last week, that being a fundamental verse that Jesus used in His teaching about marriage, and we've looked at it each week. But one of the phrases that we've looked at that we've really not spent a lot of time with is that idea of become one flesh. We really haven't given that a lot of attention. In fact, we find that term, become one flesh, it's used 5 times in the Bible. It's used here in Genesis 2:24. The rest of the times are quotations of Genesis 2:24. We've looked at just about all of them. Paul quotes it in Ephesians chapter 5 when he's comparing the relationship of husband and wife to that of Christ and His church. And we talked about that being the mystery of this exclusive relationship that God created for us. We looked at it in the passage in Mark chapter 10. By the way, there's a parallel passage in Matthew 19 where Jesus quotes this verse and then says, so they're no longer two. And what God has joined together, let no man separate them. We talked about that last week with the permanence of marriage. But Paul's going to quote it again in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, where he's talking about sexual immorality. It gives us a little bit of a clue about what becoming one flesh means. He says, don't you know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body, for it said the two will become one flesh. There he is quoting from Genesis 2:24, but he's talking about a relationship outside of marriage, a sexual relationship outside of marriage. And so one flesh, becoming one flesh, certainly emphasizes this idea of sexual union. Now, becoming one flesh is more than sex. It's more than just sexual oneness, but it's certainly the heart of what's being talked about in Genesis 2:24. The foundation of marriage has to do with this oneness thing. Again, more than just being physical, there is relational, emotional, and certainly a spiritual oneness as well. But on the other hand, if you remove sex from the context of the marriage commitment, you will experience a superficial sense of closeness. And apart from the lifelong commitment of marriage, permanence of marriage, as we talked about, sex will never bring the satisfaction that God designed it to give. That's why throughout the Bible we're warned of sex outside of the marriage relationship. Sin always hinders intimacy, whether it's outside the marriage or whether it's inside the marriage. In fact, we've talked about, as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, they recognized their nakedness and they began to hide themselves, not only from God, but they began to hide themselves from each other. That's what sin does. It hinders the intimacy that God desires for us. Oneness is the foundation of marriage, and a big part of that oneness, becoming one flesh, is the sexual relationship. While God does the joining, as Jesus tells us, one of the ways that He does that is through sex. God created sex to be a part of that bonding process. And so Genesis 2:24 talks about the bonding that takes place within the marriage relationship between married couples. But the Apostle Paul also tells us that bonding, that joining, can take place even in casual sexual relationships, which is exactly why God says He wants it reserved for the marriage relationship. And that's exactly why God says it's a significant part of the marriage relationship. So let's kind of just say it this way. Marriage was designed by God to be an intimate relationship. One where there was close intimacy experienced. The two will become one flesh. It emphasizes the physical. While there's the relational and emotional and spiritual part of that, the physical has to be read from that. And we could go on to say that intimate relationship exists best in the environment of an exclusive, principal, permanent relationship. In fact, that's kind of how this series all fits together. Is God designed marriage, and He designed the intimacy part, the one flesh part of marriage, to exist in a relationship as we've talked about. When it's exclusive, when it's just a man and a woman, when it is a relationship where there is permanency, and a relationship where the spouses put each other as a priority. God created us that way, and He created the institution of marriage to exist with this oneness that He created. And so we recognize that sexual relationship without an exclusive relationship, we would call somebody committing adultery, having an affair, multiple partners, that's not the way God intended it to be. In a sexual relationship without a principle, without a priority relationship, while that may take place in marriage, it certainly is unfulfilling and can be empty to one of the spouses. A sexual relationship without a permanent relationship, whether it's just sex outside of marriage, or whether it's a couple that are living together, or people that are just having casual sex, that's not the way God intended it. And that's not the best environment for what God intended the sexual relationship to be. The problem is that when we treat sex casually, it doesn't stop what God created sex to do. It doesn't stop the bonding process. And so what happens is that we leave pieces of ourselves around with the people that we've had sex with. What we've been told is that you can have safe sex, that you can prevent a pregnancy, that you can keep yourself from getting some sexually transmitted disease. But the problem is you can't protect your soul. And sex was created for there to be a bonding of souls. There's to be a bonding that takes place, becoming one flesh. So having sex with someone before marriage is like saying, I permanently bond myself with you without making a permanent commitment to you. It just doesn't work. Which explains the pain of breakup. It's as painful as divorce. If there's been a sexual relationship, because of your sexual union, you become one with that person. That's why it's so painful to go through that breakup process. So it's no surprise to us that studies from the University of Chicago say that the best sex, the most passionate sex, is found within the safe harbor of a lifelong monogamous relationship. It happens in marriage. Now, we read from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, but Paul is going to continue that whole thought of understanding, running from sexual immorality and then what God created sex for. He's going to continue that in the next chapter. Remember, when he's writing, he's not stopping for a chapter break. He just continues with this thought. And so he goes on to say, it's a good thing to have sexual relations. That's the question, is it? And he says, certainly, but only within a certain context. It's good for a man to have a wife and for a woman to have a husband. Sexual drives are strong, but marriage is strong enough to contain them and provide for a balanced and fulfilling sexual life in a world of sexual disorder. So we begin to understand from the Apostle Paul more about sexual intimacy. And again, he reiterates for us that it's to take place in the context of a marriage relationship. It's in that context that God says it's good, that it's a gift from God, that it's a sacred thing that God has created and given to His people, and it ought to be something that is enjoyed within that context. And he goes on in the next verse and says, the marriage bed must be a place of mutuality. The husband seeking to satisfy his wife, the wife seeking to satisfy her husband. In other words, there is to be this element that there will be sexual fulfillment within marriage. It's a part of the marital covenant that we're making. When you marry, you should expect there to be some fulfillment to take place, sexual fulfillment to take place in that relationship. God considers it a marital duty, if you will, for us to fulfill our spouse. It means that we need to pay attention to this particular area. And then he goes on and says, marriage is not a place to stand up for your rights. Marriage is a decision to serve the other, whether in bed or out. It goes back to that covenantal relationship that we talked about. You're in this relationship for the good of the relationship, not just for your own good and for your own pleasure. And this verse tells us that both men and women ought to have equal consideration in this. Both the husband and the wife have equal needs in that marriage relationship. And the truth is that, as we've talked about, men and women are different. For men, sex is often a reaction, something that stimulates us and creates a desire. For women, sex is often a decision, and until they decide that they want to be involved, their bodies don't prepare for that. And so we need to take into account for one another how that works. For men, often it's just showing up. That's all it takes. But for women, that's less likely to happen. And so in a marriage, we allot for that. We begin to try to understand one another, and we decide that we are going to be a part of serving one another. That's what it says. Marriage is a decision to serve the other. It certainly, he says, involves the sexual relationship, but it's not just about sex, that we're to serve one another. That's a part of the marriage relationship. And the sex part of it is good, and it's from God, and it's to be a part of the marriage relationship. God created it. But the good things that God creates, what Satan tries to do is to make bad what God makes good. And so what he does is, in this area of sex, he tries to get people who aren't married to have sex. And he tries to get people who are married to not have sex. We've already stated that sex is an important aspect of the marriage relationship. And there's two ways that I see that it gets messed up. Sometimes I have conversations with people. Sometimes this is from just observations that I've made. Sometimes it's my own personal experience. But there's two ways that I see the sexual relationship in marriage get messed up. This is not exhaustive. I'm sure there are others. But one of those is that it gets polluted. That it becomes just about the physical, about the sex, and not about the intimacy. The goal of the sexual relationship is for bonding and creating oneness and intimacy. And if it's just about creating desire, if it's just about fueling desire, it can be dangerous. In fact, I know married couples who have introduced other things into their marriage. The intent was that we would fuel the passion in our marriage, but it was a dangerous thing. And and in fact, there are some here today, maybe listening to this, that are on the verge of completely messing up your marriage by crossing over that line in an attempt to try to fuel some passion within the sexual intimacy of your relationship. And the writer of Hebrews guards us against it. Hebrews 13:4, honor marriage and guard the sacredness of sexual intimacy between wives and husbands. It ought to be a special thing. It ought to be a spiritual, sacred thing, holy thing the Bible tells us about. And so you be very cautious. One of the things that I see that it gets messed up is when husbands and wives try to make it just a physical thing and end up bringing other things into the marriage bed. The other big mess up that I see how sex can get messed up in marriage is it just doesn't happen. It doesn't take place. That because of one or the other or both, that there's not maybe a desire, and so it just never seems to happen. Maybe there's not time, and so sex doesn't take place in the relationship. Now, I understand that there are legitimate reasons sometimes. Sometimes there are health reasons. Sometimes there are emotional or traumatic reasons that might be taking place. I'm not talking about those kinds of situations. And so those maybe need to be set aside and dealt with in an entirely different way. But when sexual intimacy doesn't happen in a marriage relationship, it can leave one spouse feeling hurt and feeling unloved, and the relationship itself can suffer. What's interesting is that I think both of those things that I've just mentioned, the cases in which sexual intimacy within a marriage can be messed up, either because it's been polluted and other things have been included in it or other people have been included in it, or when it doesn't happen, I think both of them happen for the very same reason. I think it's because we have a very subjective view of what love and sex is. And our culture tells us that love is that marriage is all about a romantic love, a passionate love. And so if there is to be any duty that's included into it, then it has to be unhealthy. That's the way our culture feels about it. That to some point, that if you are to please your spouse, even though you're not interested in sex yourself, it would somehow be inauthentic, that it would not be genuine, that there always has to be a want, there always has to be a desire. And that understanding of love as a passionate feeling, as a desirous feeling. And if you and your spouse never have sex unless there is great mutual passion, it can put you in a dangerous cycle that can be damaging to your relationship. That it always has to be something that we have great desire for. I think one of the reasons that our culture thinks that is that sex has to be out of great passion is because sex outside of marriage is so common. And so our culture has made sex to always include the thrill and the excitement of something new, the uncertainty, which leads to a misunderstanding of what intimacy, sexual intimacy in the marriage relationship is. To understand it as a cheapened view, and we hold high these things of that passion and desire when that's not all there is to the sexual relationship. And what happens is marriages, I think, can get stuck. In fact, I think it happens this way. This is what we have been taught. This is what sex education classes give to us. This is what culture teaches us in media and the things that we read and see, that there is a desire. It starts with desire that leads to arousal, that leads to sex. It starts with desire, leads to arousal, and leads to sex. And so we've been taught that. Everyone kind of understands that principle right there. The problem is, it's not true. It's not true, especially for some people. Often for women, that's the case. And it's possible that you don't ever exhibit a beginning point of desire. You never feel that. And what happens is, if you don't feel that startup, initiation of desire, then it can make you feel bad. And when you feel bad, you don't feel like having sex. And then maybe the spouse gets upset. And the truth is, it really doesn't make any difference. God doesn't say this is always a passionate thing. He says it's an important aspect of the marriage relationship. And what happens is, it's a consequence of this understanding that love is always romantic feelings, that love is always passionate feelings. Now, that's not to say that we're not to set the environment, that we're not to set the mood and create those kinds of feelings of want and passion. In fact, in my staff meeting back a couple of months ago, I was introducing this series and talking about it a little with them and asking if they had any ideas. One of our female staffers said this: if a woman does all the chores, then sex can feel like a chore. And that's certainly the truth. There are things that are involved in setting that kind of environment. But the sexual dimension of marriage is too important to be just left to chance. So if you struggle with this thing of desire, quit letting that be the determining factor in your sexual relationship. Quit letting that be the thing that stops you from enjoying this thing that God created to be a substantial part of the marriage relationship. If you struggle with a lack of time or a lack of energy, you find some ways to simplify life or figure out how you can get some more sleep. If you have young children or you live a hurried lifestyle, maybe you and your spouse need to get away. Maybe you need to invest in a weekend away and understand it as an investment in your marriage. If you have conflicting schedules, then you may need to decide to compromise in some way. You, in fact, may need to figure out how to negotiate the differences there. You may need to schedule something. It could be that you've had something tragic happen to you that has affected you sexually. And let me just encourage you that you find someone that can help you walk through that, a counselor, a therapist. Don't let something in your past destroy such an important part of your marriage relationship. Marriage was designed by God to be an intimate relationship. Don't try to include it in a relationship outside of an exclusive relationship, outside of a principal relationship, outside of a permanent relationship. And don't try to exclude it from your marriage as well, because it's not made for that. Pray with me. Father, we thank you for teaching us in your word about this important part of intimacy within marriage. And Father, in our broken culture that is so confused and there is so much misunderstanding and untruths about that just bleed into those of us that are believers, into our lives. God, would you protect us? Would you protect our children? God, would you help parents to have significant conversations with their kids about the truth about the sexual relationship? And Father, I'm praying especially again that you would protect marriages, protect them in this area. God, help protect their marriage bed, to keep it sacred. God, I'm praying that you will help them to honor that relationship. And God, we're praying for marriages in general, God, that you would raise up husbands and wives who would love each other as Jesus has loved the church and would serve each other, whether in the marriage bed or outside of it. God, give us that kind of heart to have that kind of covenant relationship where we put the relationship over our own needs. We thank you for helping us to do that. In Jesus' name, amen.